couple of people a chance to join if they're coming. The plan today is just take a very short delve into the life of pollinators. It is National Pollinator this week, so it's something that as a business we've been looking at. It plays a really important role in what we do as John Chambers Wildflower Seeds, and we did think it would be a real shame to let the week go by without making sure that we're raising awareness as much as we possibly can. We are recording this, so if anybody wants to show this to colleagues or friends or anything afterwards, then feel free, although after half an hour of listening to me waffle on, you may decide that's probably not going to do you any favors, but absolutely see how we get on. So I'm going to crack on, and if anybody just join us late, then we can just let them in. So welcome to John Chambers Wildflower Seeds webinar all about pollinators. And this, as I've said, is to celebrate National Pollinator Week. Now that's a national event now. I think it's actually an international event now. I think it originated in America. But it now is an event that's celebrated all over the world, and it's in support of pollinator health. And the idea is it's a time to celebrate pollinators and spread the word about what we can do to protect them. One of the things that we're going to do is look at some of the issues affecting pollinators, how important they are and what role they play within our ecosystems, but also in our everyday life. And I think that's something which certainly in my research for doing this, it's very interesting to see just how unnoticed some of these things are, but actually how we're also teetering on a precipice of environmental disaster in a number of ways. But certainly with pollinators, we have an awful lot of work to do in order to be able to make sure that we're helping them and assisting them get back to where they have been before. I thought what would be interesting to do, first of all, especially since we are a wildflower company after all, is just to cover a very brief history of wildflower meadows, because I think that's a really important foundation of part of the problems that we're now having and the decline in some of the species. So a brief history of wildflower meadows. Let's go. So what is a meadow? And traditionally a meadow is an area of grassland which is left to grow long through the spring and summer months. In late summer, the grass is cut for hay and to feed animals, and that feed is used over the winter period. That area, once it's been cut, is then grazed until the ground becomes too wet during the winter months. That makes it different to a pasture, which a pasture is an area of ground that's usually grazed all year round. Now, meadows themselves can look very different, and that depends on what's growing in them. But the key feature of a meadow is that the vegetation, whatever it is left during the growing season and flowering season, and then cut after that. And that system provides an ideal habitat for many wildflowers, and it gives them an area to develop and to grow and to create other habitats as well. So we can actually trace meadows right the way back to Roman times, and there are texts that show that haymaking and meadows were very much part of Roman agriculture. Meadows were also widespread in the Anglo-Saxon farming landscape, and there are charters that give us descriptions of land even then that distinguish between pasture and meadow as different forms of grass management. So I think that just highlights just how long through our history that we have been managing areas of grassland in different ways and creating those sort of over 1,000 years, really going all the way back to Roman times where that's been happening. Even through the Norman conquest and beyond there of 1066, meadows were a distinct and valuable category of land in the Domesday Survey. The size of a meadow, this was really interesting, I thought, was recorded in either acres or ploughs, and a measure that was calculated by the amount of land that could be ploughed with a team of 8 oxen. And this gives further evidence of just how important meadows have been to the way of life really throughout our history. Coming up into the medieval period, meadows were a central part of medieval agriculture, and again, still a very valuable resource. Such was their value that meadows were often given in land grants as gifts to abbeys and monasteries. We'll explore a little bit later on whether we still feel that the value of those habitats are recognised today as much as they were then, but certainly back then they were considered to be incredibly valuable areas of land. So water meadows. Water meadows were first developed by medieval farmers, and this practice continued until the late Victorian period. And essentially what they would do is they would create channels within the meadows and ditches around the edges of them where the water would come in. What that would actually do, it would allow water to flow across the grass, depositing rich silt into the meadow. And they were also designed so they could be blocked or open to control the flow. So if in periods of heavy rainfall, they could control how much water was actually going into them. What that would also do is it would provide a much richer source of hay, meadows, and feed for the animals during the winter period. But it's also really recognizing that as time went on and this became a less common practice, this was the first sign and the start of the deterioration and decline of meadows, really. As we went into the 19th century, many were ploughed up and only a very few survived and were used until the start of the First World War. Very interestingly, I still think there are one or two sort of down Salisbury way. I'm sure there's a water meadow there, which I do mean to visit next time I'm sort of out that way. But it was the start of the decline from the 19th century onwards. So, threats to meadows. And since the end of the 19th centuries, meadows have seriously been under threat. Alternative winter feeds were reduced due to the value of the hay crops. And we had 2 world wars, and that resulted in what the government installed as a plough-up campaign. And the idea being that farmers were forced to plough areas of permanent grassland for crops like wheat or potatoes. Obviously, it was necessary then. Food was in very short supply. And that was a sign of the times that we were living in then, to make sure that we were actually providing a food source. But what it did mean was that began a serious deterioration of these meadows and habitats. And by the end of World War II, 40% of the previous grassland that we had been ploughed up. After the Second World War, this momentum carried on. We obviously had to rebuild. Society was getting bigger, populations were getting bigger, urban developments were needed, and all of these things meant there was an increased demand for arable crops, and that grassland area became more valuable then as an arable cropland rather than a grassland. And what that essentially got us to was a situation where by the 1980s, early 1990s, we'd lost 97% of its natural grassland and wildflower meadows. Now, I've sat through many presentations and I've read lots and lots of literature, and the 97% is a figure that's quoted an awful lot. But at no point really had I looked into why that was and what happened to cause that. And we can have our own opinions on the rights and wrongs of what had happened before the world changed, society changed over a period of time. But the fact of the matter was, we arrived at a point in the early 1990s and 97% of our natural grassland and meadowland had been lost. And I suppose the question then really is that important, and why does it matter? Well, it does matter, and it matters a lot, because this is taken from WWF research. 41% of UK species that have been studied have declined since 1970. 33%, a third of wild pollinator species, have decreased between 1980 and 2013. What's that? A 33-year period. That's absolutely staggering. Butterflies and moths have been particularly hard hit during that period, with butterflies down by 17% and moths by 25%. And again, we're left in this situation when you can say, well, okay, we've lost these species. The world's a different place. We live different lives. We have different demands and sort of different priorities ourselves now. Is that sort of thing really important to what we're actually doing? But yes, it is. And that's one of the things why events such as National Pollinator Week is really so important. So pollinators are responsible for a third of the food that we eat. 85 to 95% of the UK's insect pollinated crops rely on wild pollinators. And what we mean by wild pollinators is not honeybees. Honeybees are considered, especially if they're, to not necessarily be a wild one. So we're talking about other types of bees, wasps and other areas like that. And 75 to 95% of all flowering plants need help with pollination. So even if we are happy to live in a world that's less colourful and a world that's less pretty and a world that has less diversity about it. That has a direct impact on our ability to sustain ourselves as a race if our food sources are going to be detrimentally affected in the way that they are by the fact that without pollinators, how are we going to be able to feed ourselves? And is it too late to do anything about that? So if we look a little bit more detailed into the pollinator decline, bumblebees and solitary bees can collect nectar from a wide number of plants, garden flowers. So they, in terms of the meadow grassland, have probably been less affected than some other types of pollinators. Species that have got more selective flower and visiting habits or have special requirements for nest sites that allows them to have habitats to breed have declined much more drastically. And many species of moth and butterfly are in decline, as we looked at 17% and 25% for moths and 17% for butterflies are in decline due to habitat loss. So if that continues the way it is, that raises some serious questions about, how we are going to operate in the future. Other reasons for declining numbers. We've looked at the declining meadows, and that's obviously a major part of it. So habitat loss and land use change is a real significant factor in how pollinator species have declined over the years. But also foraging, the amount and quality of flowering resources have declined. And this is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if we are reducing the number of pollinators and the species of pollinators that we have, then they are unable to pollinate some of the plants. So the number and quality of the plants that they feed from deteriorates as well. And therefore you have this vicious circle of continued decline, both of the host and the pollinator. Nesting and breeding sites. We're not necessarily talking about bird nesting and things here. We're talking about the nesting sites for pollinators. Some of them need very specific habitats in order to be able to nest and breed. By removing meadows, by not having these environments for them, it prevents them from actually being able to thrive as a species. Climate change is a huge one. I'm opening the window today and inviting the bumblebees in because of the fact it's so warm. And we all know how the climate has changed so much in recent years. Even within the UK alone, we've had record temperatures one year, record rainfall the next. Every month seems to be setting a new record average temperature, and that's just within the UK. Our food sources don't just come from within the UK, they come from all over the world, and that's happening now. We've had what we feel has been one of the coldest Junes that we can remember for a while. It's just been wet and miserable all year, whereas other parts of the world are going through extreme heat waves at the moment. So that climate change across the world has a significant impact on our abilities to sustain the pollination. You've also got to look at pesticide use. I'm going to skirt over that one a little bit and just recognise the fact that there is evidence there that suggests that obviously pesticides do have a detrimental impact on pollinators. The reason I'm skirting over it is not because I don't necessarily agree with it, but because I know it's a very in-depth subject, and we could probably do a presentation of half an hour length just on that alone. But safe to say that is definitely one of the reasons why we're struggling so much and pollinators are in serious decline, and something that we will have to take seriously at some point if we're not doing already. So back to basics in terms of pollinators. Plants rely on pollinators to move pollen, to reproduce seed and keep the plant species going. Plants produce pollen in different ways. Some produce more pollen and nectar than others, and plants flower at different times of the year, making them attractive to the insects required for pollinating. The most efficient pollination relies on a diverse community of insects. More pollinating insects, the higher the quantity and the quality of pollination. And I think what we mean by that, and one of the reasons why National Pollinator is such a good idea, or National Pollinator Week, is it's very easy for us in today's society to be focused in on one or two things. Everybody knows how important bees are to the planet. You can ask anybody and they'll tell you about save the bees, don't do this, don't do that, look after the bees. And obviously we want to carry on with that. We're not suggesting we ignore the bees for a second, but bees are only one very small part of the pollination ecosystem. And it's really important that we highlight and understand how diverse that kind of sort of ecosystem needs to be. How many other pollinators are there out there? We're doing great things for some, but are we overlooking some of the others? So thinking about things like the type of flowers that we have, and the time of year that they flower, how important these things are at different times of year as well. So looking at that and thinking about that, just going to bring up our old friend the dandelion, which is not necessarily a popular plant, particularly amongst gardeners. What's the first thing they do in spring when it starts to flower? Get the lawnmower out and go over and get rid of all of them. And that's typical really in a lot of areas. But dandelions, because they're a very early flowering plant, are incredibly important for the pollination, for pollinators. They predominantly flower in May and June, and they're vital for early emerging pollinators, especially baby bees. Bees, butterflies, and beetles rely on those. They're their first source, or one of their first sources of nectar, very, very early on in the year. And then we can look at other types of plants. This is one of my particular favourites. I don't know if anybody recognises it. You're welcome to pop it into the chat's comments if you do. I'll give you a second just to have a go if you want to. But what this is borage. Now, borage is incredibly popular with the beekeeping community. And there is a really, really good reason for that. Apart from being really pretty, I think it's a beautiful looking little thing. What borage does, which is different to an awful lot of plants, is it offers pretty much a never-ending nectar source for them. As the animals and the insects go in there and actually collect the nectar, very often with many plant species, it can take up to 24 hours for them to actually replenish nectar sources. With some of them, they can do it a bit quicker, it might be a couple of hours. Borage can replenish its nectar sources in as little as 2 minutes. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And one of the main reasons why borage is so popular with the bee community. I don't know whether you've actually tasted honey that's made. They have a couple of different flowers, but borage honey also tastes absolutely lovely as well. So it's another good reason for doing that. But it's not just about the flowers. I mentioned before about things like food production. And there are some stats here which, again, highlight just how important pollinators are, not just to our environment in terms of the ecological side of things, but actually potentially to our own survival as a human race. And estimates state that 84% of EU crops, to the value of £12.6 billion, rely on pollinators. 80% of wildflowers rely on pollinators in order to be able to keep the species going. Not only do they rely on them, but crop production improves with better pollination. Numerous UK bees, including the rarer species, pollinate foods like cabbage, mustard, oilseed rape, turnip, kale, cauliflower, broccoli, and sprouts. So from a food point of view, you don't necessarily think that having wildflowers nearby can make sure that your turnip crops are as effective as they are and give us better yields. You might not like turnips, you might not care, but the fact of the matter is there's an awful lot of food sources there which rely very, very heavily on pollinators in order to be able to make their crops better, not just to survive, but to actually increase yields, to make them more productive. Something that I considered as well, we now go to any shop pretty much now, go to Greggs, and you'll find plant-based food in there. And there's a real surge towards people using plant-based food as a way of being kinder to the environment in total. Well, that's fine. Great idea. Personally, I'm not quite ready to give up my bacon sandwiches yet, but never say never. But if we carry on with the decline in pollination species that we have at the moment, what are the chances that we're actually going to be able to sustain a plant-based diet for the planet moving forward? So if we're doing one thing because we feel it's better for the environment, there has to be more joined up thinking in terms of how are we going to protect the environment to allow it to provide the resources that we need ourselves. As we said before, there are also several types of pollinators. Some of these we know, the bees, covered the bees and the butterflies, but the moths, the hoverflies, the birds, the beetles, the wasps, the thrips, and even the bats. I don't think there are many particularly pollinating bats within the UK, but in certain parts of the world, bats play an incredibly important role in pollinating. I believe tequila is made from a plant which is pollinated by bats. So next time you have a shot, then remember where it came from. But these are the ones which, as a general rule, we would consider to be pollinators within the UK. Now, clearly, the popular ones there we have, and everyone knows about saving the bees, and everyone knows about the butterflies and even the moths to a certain point. But what about all the others? And I felt it would be, during National Pollinator Week, it would be remiss of us if we didn't give a shout out to some of the underdogs, because we don't always like these. These are the unpopular ones. These are the ones that when you see them, we want to avoid them or get rid of them, or get your vibrating stick out or whatever it is to kill the wasps. But actually, these are all incredibly important pollinators and play an incredibly important role in the pollination of plants, food sources, and everything else that goes along with it. Nobody likes wasps, but are we going to think differently next time we see a wasp and actually realise that it is, in fact, our friend? Same with moths. Some moths can be absolutely beautiful, and if you look into them, there's some incredible species of moths out there. But the ones that bang on our windows at night when we've got the lights on, or the ones that manage to get in and fly around the light bulbs and everything else that goes with it, we're not quite so keen on those, and they're not quite as popular. And there doesn't seem to be anywhere near the traction for a Save the Moths campaign as there is for a Save the Bees campaign. Hoverflies, well, they look like wasps, don't they? So they're going in the same category as wasps, and we don't like them. And look at those horrible beetles and thrips. Unless you Chris Packham, you're going to look at that and you're going to think, ooh, I don't really like that, and I don't want one of those. But these also play an incredibly important role in the pollination of plants and the pollination of food sources. So we need to make sure we're giving consideration to how we can help these, how we can help create habitats, how we can help create food sources for them, and maybe look at them in a slightly different way than we have done so far. So, pollinators and crops, because from a purely food point of view, this is obviously something that's going to be really important. I just pick out a few highlights there, really. I don't want to read that word for word. But what it does is it shows the variety. So oilseed rape is pollinated by short-tongued insects, including hoverflies and honeybees. So there's your hoverfly coming in and doing a good job, as well as the bumblebee. Insect pollination increases the number of seeds produced and the oil content of these seeds, increasing overall yield. Now, if we've been spraying off these crops for years to try and remove all the pests and things for them, isn't it about time that we recognise that some of these, what we think as pests, can actually give us a better return on these as well? Strawberries is a popular one, because whether we grow strawberries commercially or whether, like me, you keep trying to grow them in your garden to very little success, but they're an open-fronted flower, so they're visited by solitary bees, hoverflies and bumblebees again, and pollination by insects results in more successful fruiting. So the next time I want to grow a better crop of strawberries in my garden, I need to make sure I'm providing an environment that the pollinators that make that more successful are actually going to work. This fascinated me. Tomatoes, aubergines and peppers require buzz pollination, which relies on bumblebees and some solitary bee species producing vibrations using their flight muscles to dislodge the pollen. Pollination by these buzz pollinators increases the number and size of the fruits produced. There's a common theme in terms of the fact that the better the pollination, the more pollinators we have, the better these crop yields are going to be. But it's also really, really interesting for us to recognise that pollinators don't just mean one thing. They mean lots of different things. And we have to recognise that we have a variety of things that we can do, and more than one thing is going to be necessary. So let's think about how we're going to help things. How are we going to make the world a better place? What can we do with our little patch in order to be able to do that? Now, clearly, agriculture is going to play an important role in this. You think back to Roman times, where they recognized even then how important agriculture and managing agriculture in the right way was. But obviously, right now, we're in a very different situation, very different world, and it's not possible for us to go back to within that. But UK government statistics tell us that 70% of land in the UK, that equates to 17 million hectares, is utilised as agricultural land. The total cropping area of that is 6 million hectares. Now, if I take 17 million hectares of agricultural land available and say that only 6 million hectares of that is used as areas to grow crops, that leaves us with an awful lot of land available within agriculture that could potentially be giving over to creating better habitats for wildlife, for pollinators, And actually, what it's going to do is it's going to give agriculture an increased and better yield potentially as a result of doing that. So maybe the focus of where we are needs to shift ever so slightly. So what are the opportunities for agriculture and for farmers to help out a little bit? So they've got expansive areas of land that can be utilised for this. But how do we actually use that land? Restoring healthy populations of wild insect pollinators, we do need to address the factors that have contributed to the decline. So managing and restoring existing natural habitats, really important. But also look for ways to link these together, using flower-rich corridors such as field margins and hedgerows. Every field margin, every field hedgerow is an opportunity to be able to put a little bit back into this and actually do something differently. Road verges as well are actually a brilliant one. There's an organisation in York called, forgive me, I think it's called Place, but I might have got that wrong. I think it's called Place. And they've done some fantastic work over the last 30 years of monitoring and tracking and registering what's going on in road verges. And they are a hugely under-resourced opportunity for us to create habitats. And if we can work with local authorities and actually encourage local authorities to manage these in a different way, then we can actually use that land and create some incredible habitats and corridors. We've also got increasing crop yields that come as a result of doing this, which has a commercial and economic benefit. So we're not just doing what's right for the environment and what's right for the planet. Also, commercially and economically, it's better for everybody as well. And also it's reduced in pest management. You know, you've got situations where if you create habitats that are more suitable for bats, bats will help you with your pest control because they will keep some of those insects down that might normally be used to get rid of them using chemicals and other such ways of actually doing that. So obviously what we need to do here is we need to create better habitats for pollinators. One of the ways that we can do that obviously is establishing wildflower areas, be it meadows, be it margins, be it hedgerows, be it whatever. And it's really important from organisations such as ours that we consider exactly how we do that, because there is lots and lots of different ways of doing it. So it was just to give you a little bit of an insight really into what we do and how we can have an impact on things like that. So we would design seed mixes for specific pollinators. And we can do that in the way of looking at whether it's for bats, whether it's for birds, whether it's for bumblebees, whether it's for honeybees, whatever it is, going back to the idea that all of that kind of diversity. So we would look at what flowers are more suitable to those, the size of the flowers, are they tube flowers, are they open flowers, when do they flower, what time of year do they flower? Are they all going to flower in the spring and mean that you've got nothing left for the rest of the year? We want to make sure that what you're doing is getting a variety of flowers there that are going to open up at various different times of the year and provide a consistent source of nectar, a consistent food source for all of the pollinators that need it. We also look to make sure mixes are balanced. I'm sure some people understand what that means. Some won't. There's quite a few people on the thing today, and I think a few of them are potentially people who just want to look at how they can do things in their own garden. When we look at balancing a mix, every single seed is a different size and weight. So if you were to buy, let's say, 1 kilogram of a 100% wildflower mix, that's going to contain a number of different types of seed within there, but they're all different. So if we gave you over 100 grams, for example, 1 gram of one seed, 1 gram of another, 1 gram of seed A could be 5,000 seeds. 1 gram of seed B could be 500 seeds. So if we don't balance the mix by making sure that what we're doing is creating an equal number of seeds, or as close as possible to an equal number of seeds, then you can find an area becomes less diverse, because the species with 5,000 seeds in a gram is going to completely dominate, and therefore you're not going to have that range of diversity that you would want to have. Looking at some of the specific mixes that we can offer, things like bumblebee mixes. There are 20 species of bumblebee in the UK, and they have varying different lengths of tongue, although many have got short ones. So we want to make sure we include a good mix of open and tube-shaped flowers so that all of the nectar is accessible for all of the pollinators that use it. Same as the birds, things like teasel and wild carrot, which attract birds. They're very, very good for those. Honeybees. So there's several hundred different bee species in the UK, but there's only one type of honeybee, which is the European honeybee. And due to their short proboscis, if you want to use the technical term, I prefer tongue because it's easier for me to remember. It's easier for them to forage from open flowers such as poppies and daisies, borage as well. And that's why if we're putting a mix together specifically for honeybees, we will look at providing a different mix of flowers and a different ecosystem for them than perhaps we would for bumblebees. But what we can also do there is look at general mixes as well. So perhaps you haven't got a particular soil type, or you haven't got particular requirement for one or two different types of pollinators. We can do more general mixes that just make sure you get a variety of heights, a variety of flowers, a variety of shapes, and that they try and flower at different times of the years. But it isn't just about agriculture. It isn't just about the farmers. It isn't just about people with large expanses of land. Small areas really, really do still count with this. And there is research that shows 85% of urban pollination comes from small areas such as a front garden. And a study found that there is actually no correlation between the size of the garden and the nectar available. And I think that's going back to the idea of the fact that these flowers will continue to replenish their nectar sources for as long as they are in flower. So therefore, pollinators can come in and get a great source of nectar on today, and tomorrow can come back and go again. So you don't have to have a huge area in order to be able to do this. What we do need to do is to look at the size of the area that we have and that we're looking to manage, and make sure that we're doing absolutely the right thing to get the best out of it. So can we make sure that we've got different types of flower in there, different types of nectar, different types of flowering seasons with them all as well? Not just about the nectar, but also considering those habitats. Go back to the beginning of the presentation when we were looking at the idea that nesting sites and breeding sites for a lot of these pollinators are in decline as well. So are we making those habitats, the log piles, the insect hotels, the natural environments for these things to actually be able to survive and thrive within as well? I think we're just about done. There was just a couple of things I was going to mention in doing my research today, because there are lots of toolkits and things. Clearly, as a business, and I'm not just here to do a sales pitch, but I am, we can help with commercial organisations, with domestic organisations. If you want to have a chat with us about how you can turn an area of land over to a meadow that's going to be suitable for you, we are very, very happy to do that. We travel all over the country. I was in Devon a couple of weeks ago. We were in Oxford the other day. We're going north next week. We will come and talk to you, and we will be able to help you come up with plans about how we can do this and what we can do. But as well as that, as we mentioned, there's also the opportunities for people to do a huge amount of difference, or make a huge amount of difference with very, very small areas. So I found some resources which I thought might be worth sharing. If anybody needs contact with these, then I'd be very happy to do that. But National Pollinator Week produce a pollinator toolkit, and it's fabulous. And you just go through there and it gives you ideas about how to do different things, different projects, what different types of pollinators you might have in your area, and how to help with that. I also found a really, really useful how-to guide. This is actually from Ireland, but I don't think the pollination in Ireland is that much different than it is here, but there's probably going to be a local version as well. All really, really useful toolkits that give you ideas on how we can help create nesting sites, and how we can, help to, recover the damage that's been done over several years. I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you for your time. There are some contact details on there. Georgia, who's our technical manager, would normally be here to answer most of your technical questions because she's far more intelligent than I am. However, if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat box at the bottom of the screen now, and we will do our best. Anything that I don't know the answer to, I will make sure we get back to you with. So I'll give you a few seconds just to see whether or not anybody does have any questions on there for us, while I check out for low-flying bumblebees and so on coming in. Okay, look, it doesn't look like anyone's got any questions there at all, so that's absolutely fine. If anyone does have anything coming through, then like I said, my contact details are on there, and you can get in touch with John Chambers directly through the website or through our phone number, and we'll be very, very happy to help you out with anything. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope it, if anything, has just provided a little bit of an insight into the problems that we face and really why we should be doing something about it. There's a lot of work to do. But a little amount can make a big difference, and I think it's important not to forget that. So I will say thank you very much. I'm off to have a sandwich, enjoy the sunshine, and thank you all for your attendance today. Cheers.